Genevieve Leung is Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Language at the University of San Francisco. She co-directs the Asian Pacific American Studies minor and is the academic director of the MA in Asia Pacific Studies program. Her research examines language cultural maintenances of Cantonese varieties in the Bay Area. And Corina Mong is a J. Paul Getty Scholar at the University of San Francisco, majoring in biology and minoring in Asian Pacific American Studies. She is interested in public health and medicine with a desire to create more social and health equitable future, especially for the underserved communities. Ellie Ho is an undergraduate student at the University of San Francisco, majoring in psychology and minoring in Asian Pacific American Studies and public service and community engagement. They are especially interested in community work and social justice. Now let's welcome the three presenters.
All right, thanks for staying to the end and for being here for our presentation on Chinese American headstones in Montana. So here's a kind of quick breakdown of our presentation and what we'll be discussing today. I'm not quite sure how familiar you all are with Chinese American history or Cantonese. So we'll be giving kind of this really quick context as to who we are as Chinese American researchers, as well as a little bit about the specific region and languages that we're going to be talking about today. So you heard about us in the really nice description earlier. I'm Genevieve. These are my two undergraduate students, Ellie and Corina. You can see our work is interdisciplinary, but what drew us together really is our shared interest in better understanding Chinese American history, as well as languages. So Ellie, Corina, and I speak Cantonese and Mandarin, and I also speak a variety of Cantonese called Hoi Sanwa, which is what we'll talk a little bit more in this next slide. So between 1870 and 1930, depending on which source you look at, between 70 and 90% of resident Chinese populations in the US came from a region in China called Li in Hoi Sanwa, or Sei Yup in Cantonese, or Si in Mandarin. So literally it means 4 districts. Standard Cantonese is part of the nearby 3 districts or Sam Yup region. And so because of the proximity of the 4 districts to various seaports, much of the early ethnic Chinese immigration to the US came from these 4 districts, with Hoisan sending off the largest population of people, mostly as laborers. So if you've learned anything about Chinese history in textbooks before, maybe there's a little bit a blurb about like Chinese gold miners or laborers, and this is the specific region southern China that these laborers were from. Speakers from the Hoisan region of the 4 districts spoke Hoisanwa, also known as Toisanese or Toishanese, which is the English rendering based on the standard Cantonese pronunciation, and Taishanese, which is based on the English rendering of Mandarin, of the Mandarin pronunciation. And so while there are regional differences across these 4 districts, they're usually largely lumped together as is monolithic Cantonese. And so what we hope to show in this presentation is that the language used and spoken by these early Chinese immigrants may have kind of been slowly erased with the increase of popularity in languages like Mandarin, but there still are very visible, vibrant remnants of these immigrants' lives and their histories that still can be unearthed. So now we'll move on to Ellie, who will talk more about this project.
So the aim of our project is to inspect the headstones of Chinese Americans in the 4 cities from Montana, which are Helena, Billings, Butte, and Bozeman, to give insight into the broader Chinese immigration experience, due to this experience often being generalized to just California or not even talked about at all. These Chinese Americans have a history in Montana, and we aim to carve out a space for them by inspecting these headstones and talking about headstone practices. So our project is a part of a larger project run by Professor Mark Johnson, which is funded by the Montana History Foundation grant. And he recruited us because he required these specific language skills we as a team have to romanize and translate these headstones. So his aim of his project is to identify the individuals and try to research their lives and experiences in Montana, and identify their home villages in China and connect with descendants of the buried. So here's a map of the United States. where you can see where Montana is located. And then on the right is a larger map of Montana. And the 4 cities where the headstones are circled, which are Helena, Butte, Bozeman, and Billings.
And here's a picture of the cemetery at China Row, which is near Helena, Montana, where some of the Chinese Americans of this project were buried. So it's interesting to note that even in death, Chinese Americans were excluded from being buried with white Americans at the time. So now Corina will discuss our methodology.
So what we did as a team is we took on 40 headstones of these early Chinese immigrants from the 4 different cities in Montana, and we divided these headstones amongst each other for initial translating, transcribing, and romanizing. And we met every 2 weeks to share our findings, express our thoughts, and address any difficulties that we may have encountered while working with these headstones. And this took place over the span of about 3 months. And after completing our initial round of headstones, we cross-checked each other's work and addressed any suggestions, differences of interpretation, and errors. And a final round of inspection was conducted collectively. And to ensure accuracy, any characters that were indiscernible or what our team just couldn't decipher on our own, we reached out to family members more literate in either Hoisan, Cantonese, or Mandarin. And ultimately, as a team of second-generation Chinese Americans and Asian American scholars, we reflected on how the documentation of these naming practices helped gain insight into how onomastics can shed light onto recovering and amplifying these silenced voices in archival data.
So now we'll move on to kind of the presentation of some of the main findings of the data. And we start by sharing this quote from prominent Chinese American onomastic scholar Emma Wu Lui, who talks about the significant amount of information that Chinese American names are embedded with. And in this case of our Montana data, this was also very true. So we noticed that there were really interesting interactions of inscription, literacy, and naming that we'll share with you here. It includes kind of the themes of the range of quality of headstones, the existence of this kind of incorrect or maybe miswritten characters that also include kind of missing details or secret details on the headstones. And also we'll show an example of kind of this Pan-Asian generalization. And before we move on, just in case those of us may not be kind of familiar or have seen very many Chinese American headstones, we'd like to quickly show 2 examples. Both of them are from Louis's book on Chinese American names. So typically on the gravestone, it includes the person's name in Chinese characters, the name in English, where their ancestral home was. So sometimes it includes as specific as the district, the town, and the village, and then also when the person was born and when they died. And so you'll see some of these features present in the data we're going to show, with also some of the features might be missing in some of the data as well.
So to kind of continue off of that, one of the trends like was noted in our data was the range and quality of these headstones. So for example, here we have these headstones that are located in Butte, Montana, and we note that some of these characters are actually written incorrectly. As noted in this first image here on the left-hand side, a headstone belonging to Guangzhou Noi, the character on the far right, Hoi, for Huiping, which is a county in China, was written incorrectly, and the second arrow on the left, pointing to the character Guan, which is part of the person's name, was written in a simplified form. And we pose the idea that perhaps these errors and just general inconsistencies may be due to lower levels of literacy by the scribe, or was just done in a hurry and not proofread. And in comparison to the image on the bottom right, we observe that this headstone displays higher quality and just better spatial arrangement of the characters compared to the upper left headstone. However, the attention, care, and maintenance of the headstone on the bottom right is lacking, as our team had more difficulty interpreting what was written due to the way the stone was dug in. However, we believe that the cover parts of the stone actually are the date of death. And despite these 2 headstones being within the same city and vicinity of each other, the quality of these 2 greatly vary.
So in comparison to the previous headstone, these papers tell a story of the care and detail put into the process of making these headstones. As you can see, labeled 1, the paper on the right matches up with one of the gravestones we were given. We deduced that these papers are from the family members who bought the grave and wrote out these Chinese characters for the grave to be inscribed. You can see there was a lot of effort into writing these characters indicated from the folded line to make sure the characters are written neatly and straight. These papers help encapsulate the full process from paper to headstone. In the paper labeled 2 on the left-hand side, there is an archaic character circled. The way we collected data is by inputting these characters using a Chinese character keyboard. However, this character did not exist in the keyboard in the computer output, but exists in old Chinese dictionaries. It originates from the Qing dynasty. This points to how old our data set is. The archaic character expresses a location of sorts, which means this place doesn't exist using this name or character anymore. And now this small piece of history exists on this gravestone.
So to continue the discussion on the usage of archaic characters, the person's name here, Ma Yimak, part of their name Yimak, was written incorrectly on the grave. And we note this as incorrect since it's not documented as an archaic character, and nor does it exist. So we recorded and transcribed it based on what this character most closely resembles and what it seems like it tried to be used as. Furthermore, in analyzing this headstone, we infer that the higher quality and care of this headstone just potentially indicates a class difference when we compare it to the other headstones that we saw from our data, which are also located within Bozeman. And things that are indicative of this are features such as the characters here being more jutted out, opposed to being more carved or etched in like we saw in the previous images. And we also note the designs and the framing of the headstone and just the general care to shape. And it centers more on the aesthetics of the gravestone and the recording of the name and where they're from, but excludes the date of death, which is traditionally found on these headstones.
So similar to the previous gravestone, this one has an elaborate border. Like other graves, this could be indicative of class and how much money was spent on the engraving. This gravestone belongs to Chen Gokbui, and you can see there's an English name written on it as well, Chin Fa. However, this English name does not match the romanization of his Chinese name, which could mean this name is either a nickname, the English name he went by, or the people who ordered the grave romanized his name incorrectly. There's also minimal information on this grave compared to other graves. It only has his name and where in China he's from. There is no date of death or birth. Additionally, there are characters written incorrectly. On the right, the character Yun, the middle part is written as an asterisk. And then on the left, the two characters, Gaohui, are part of his name and have incorrect strokes. Given how gravestones are the last documentation of a person's life, the incorrect characters for his name is an injustice. From these incorrect characters, we can make an educated guess that the people carving the tombstone did not know or understand Chinese characters, which is why they carved them incorrectly. So this gravestone looks very different from the previous one. It seems cramped with characters as if they're trying to fit as much information as possible. You can see that it also seems to have more of a handcrafted aspect versus the last one that seemed to have more of a font. This might be indicative of class due to the lack of border and how it is simpler than the rest. Taking a closer look at it and unearthing the details, we can reveal a bit more. This gravestone belongs to Chen Zhonghing, and you can see in the bottom left corner, labeled 1 and circled, it states another name, which could be his official paper name, Bin Hing. Additionally, the characters circled and labeled 2, the character circled and labeled 2 is an abbreviated way of writing the character Zhong. It is common for Chinese people to write this character in an abbreviated way when they're in a rush or writing casually, but uncommon for something as important as a tomb. This brings forth the question of why someone would choose to write it as such, especially when it's a part of their name. Possibly Chen Zhonghing always wrote his name that way, which is why they chose to engrave it as such. On the bottom right and labeled 3, there are 2 different calendars which are used to list the day of his death, which is not very common. It uses the has the lunar calendar and the sun calendar, which is the Gregorian used by the Western world. And finally, the characters circled 4 are unique characters used to represent numbers called Suzhou code. These are not the traditional characters used for writing numbers. Suzhou code was popularly used in Chinese markets before the 1990s. To the casual onlooker, the gravestone just looks busy, but if you take the time to unearth these details hidden in plain sight, you can see the true complexity of this grave.
So despite these cemeteries being designated for early Chinese immigrants, the person buried here we believe to be Japanese as the circle number 1 that translates to Aoki Umeko, and we infer that they are Japanese because the usage of the 4 characters instead of a traditional 3 in a Chinese name, and it is a characteristically Japanese name. So while we're unsure of who was responsible for scribing and engraving the headstone, we assume out of respect for Aoki Umeko as a Japanese person, the scribe references the Taisho era for their date of death, which existed in Japan, not in China. And to further elaborate on the quality of the gravestone, we make note that certain characters, such as circles number 2 there, are misspelled and just written incorrectly. And this could potentially be due to the person who was scribing or engraving the headstone not being Chinese themselves. And in addition to using the Taisho era as a date of reference, we also note the unusual way the year was written. So instead of writing the year as just 1918, as we would see in the other gravestones, this one is written as 1918, which is labeled number 3 and circled on the right side. So ultimately, with this one case, we are left with more questions than answers, as we can only infer that the person buried here is Japanese, and we can't fully conclude the jumps that were made from between the scribe and engraver to the deceased.
Great. So I guess in terms of just closing comments, you can see, hopefully we illustrated to you through our examples that headstones do speak with many details hidden in plain sight, right? So reflecting on this work together, I think it really does highlight the need for collaboration, not just sort of interdisciplinary collaboration, but also multi-generational, including academic and so-called like everyday knowledge into archival research, which I think was a really big learning process for us as researchers here. And as 3 Chinese Americans who grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, I think we really did reflect on how there was such a big range of sort of the so-called the Chinese experience, which obviously is not singular, right? It's very, very diverse. And we were exposed to one of these strands of diversity through this project. And so what we learned about and grew up with really never included Chinese American history in Montana. Actually, I didn't realize that there were so many Chinese Americans in Montana so early. And so moving forward, more work needs to be done to include these histories, these voices, as well as investigating names. And I think names and headstones here, as we've shown, really have been a really fruitful way for us to start doing this and investigating this process.
Thank you very much for your wonderful collaboration and your fascinating presentation. Okay, so questions are welcome.
I was wondering, is there an indication of their occupations? What were they doing in Montana? Do you have any idea about that? I mean, I know that Chinese were brought into the States for various kinds of labor here and there. It varied, of course, on the particular industry that needed labor. Was there any indication that you could see for what they were doing in these cities?
Not through their gravestones and or headstones, so it didn't mention their occupations there. But I think based on Mark Johnson's project, he also researches early Chinese history in Montana. That's his specialty. And so they're mostly, like most Chinese labor immigrants to the US at the time, laborers, miners, cooks, laundry people. So I think those would be the kind of the general occupations that they occupied in Montana. Thanks for your question.
No, thank you so much for your presentation. When I was doing some research on the name Chuck several years ago, I ran across something that said that in Cantonese is actually normally not a name, but is more a title similar to the English Mr. But the first 2 gravestones you showed in the first picture they both started off with Hon Li and Sing Hong. And I wondered is it correct that that means Mr., or is it really a part of the name?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, yes, I drew these two examples from Emma Wu Louis' book. And so she has a section on and the use of And so it is not just Mr. So my family, uses Ling as my sort of nickname. And so can be both for male and female names. So it's not just Mr. But you're right. So this generally, it could be somebody's sort of first, their given name. But oftentimes it's used sort of as a sort of a diminutive or like a nickname for people that's used in conjunction with their given name. Thanks for your question. I think there was a question about graves in Montana still visited in April. We didn't visit. So to clarify our methodology, Mark, who is in Montana, took photos of all the graves that he wanted us to transcribe and translate. And so he visited the graves. They're still there. If you want to go to Montana, to those 4 cities, you could find those exact graves. So they're still alive.
Okay, thank you, Alexa Prince. Okay, Katie Swindler, to everybody. This is so interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about the kind of research you want to undertake with this data moving forward?
Actually, I know that throughout this process, when we're putting together our data and how like Mark's work had been published and put on the news, there have been a few people that reached out, kind of contacting to say, I know I have ancestry there, wondering if you find any data. And I think it'd be especially really interesting if we were able to connect or find more connections with people, like families that are either still in the US or somewhere back in China. So I think definitely networking and putting ourselves out there to see if there's any family connections out there we can get in contact with would be really a good step to move this forward.
After doing this project, we really have been getting emails about graves. Can you help us translate this grave? Or like, my ancestors are also from Montana and Chinese American. So it really did open our eyes to kind of the non-West Coast Chinese American experience that needs to be sort of amplified more.
Okay, we still have about 5 minutes, so more questions are welcome.
No pressure. I know.
And I would say that
really tired.
you have listed a lot of fascinating facts about the gravestones. And I think that you need to have a classification of those findings and possibly support them with quantitative data, okay, classification and quantitative data, so that you can move forward and find out the reasons why these gravestones are showing this way or that way. And probably you need to also find out what is left unrecorded in gravestones. Probably those are more important for the Chinese experience. I believe that most of the laborers in that period were not memorized at all. And these gravestones have really shown us part of the experience. Probably they are from even people with better living, or okay. So this is my preliminary understanding. It's a very great project. I hope that you can move on.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. And definitely, I think both Corina and Ellie mentioned this idea of the class several times in the data, right? I think that, yeah, the fact that class does matter. A lot of these were very, lower class folks. The fact that there is this kind of documentation that can emerge, that does still exist is pretty impressive. And so exactly, I think looking at quantitative findings would help to really solidify what it is that we do know, and what it is that, is, like you said, unspoken and unrecorded. I think it would be cool to go to, I think also the fact that hanging out in cemeteries is probably a little taboo. So maybe and it's also sort of about like, would the ancestors of these folks be okay with us just like taking photos of their ancestors' graves and things like that, right? And so the question of like what to do with this data and how to collect it, how to best commemorate and do right by the folks who are buried there, right? Is a really big question.
It's really very fascinating. Or probably you can make a comparison of the gravestones from Chinese and those from Americans or Mexicans or other people from other countries in that same period. What are the differences? If they have statistical significance, that might show much more things. But it's really a great project. It costs a lot of money, time, efforts, and bravery, etc. So I wish you best of luck.
Thanks. Thank you.
It's really very great. Yeah. And in the chat box, we can see 2 thanks from Katie Swindler. I love that. Thanks so much. And from Alexa Prince, thanks to the 3 of you again. Thank you very much. Time is almost up, so we will end this session.